Well, very nice to be here. I was actually recruited to this organization when I was living in Vancouver, so it's nice to see the growth of the party over here. I'm very, very proud of that, and very proud of all of you for doing the work. It's hard work, but it needs to be done. Why are we having this discussion? Well, I think for most people that look around the world, it seems like the world has gone mad. The world is seized by some strange force. Everyone can feel it. What's going on? Even the way that the main politicians, the bourgeoisie, talk about it is something is seriously wrong, and everyone's looking for a solution. The mainstream kind of liberals cannot explain what's happening. They cannot understand what is going on. They always seem to be bemoaning the divisiveness, the hate, the extremism that's gripping society, right? They can't, and we all have to exercise it out. Maybe we can use the state to police people online or in real world and stop them from drawing conclusions, extreme conclusions. But this isn't surprising for Marxists, what is happening in the world. And this isn't something to be even scared about. This is a common thing that happens when a system like capitalism enters into a period of decline, which is precisely what we are seeing today. And this presentation discussion is titled New World Disorder, because one of the defining features of the decline of capitalism today is basically the dissolution of the old world order that was established after World War II, and especially in the 90s when the Soviet Union fell. And the rise of, I won't say a rise of a new world order, but a rise of a disorder in the world. And with it, we should discuss what that means, because if we are building the forces of communism, if we are fighting for a new world, we have to understand the current world we are in and what is happening and why. So the benefit of being a Marxist is we can rise above the events occurring before us. We can take a long view of history, and we therefore are able to kind of have our bearings about us. We can see the process before us. We don't get demoralized and depressed by an ephemeral movement that occurs, or some reactionary mood, or some right-wing politician that wins an election. You see this quite common on the left. People, oh my God, and everyone's depressed about it. We don't get like that. If you're a Marxist, you have a long view. You see the ups and the downs, and we are able to position ourselves as a force in history to change the world. So Marxism is a long view of history. What does that mean? Well, we are fighting to overthrow the capitalist system. It's not a small task, comrades. It's a very big task. We've set before ourselves a big task. And capitalism is the most powerful system that has ever existed. It is a world system. It has come to dominate the entire world. This is the first time it has come to dominate the entire world. Like I said, the Soviet Union has been collapsed, was all brought into the capitalist sphere. China is a capitalist power now, has been brought into, is a major trading power in the world. Its tentacles have reached everywhere. This long view of history that we have, we can kind of see at what point of the process we are at. And so capitalism as a system has been around for a few hundred years. The early phase, when it was displacing feudalism, it played, as Marx described, a relatively progressive role, actually developing the productive forces, the Industrial Revolution, etc. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. And then it entered its imperialist phase. That's where the small producer of sort of free competition, if you want to call it that, was replaced by monopoly capitalism. You had imperialism, these big powers fighting for world domination. That's what World War I was. That's what the scramble for Africa was. And World War II is essentially a continuation of World War I. But in this imperialist epoch, This was a similar period, actually, in the 20s and 30s. It was, and it's not as though, imperialism, there was an imperialist conflict and everything it was a similar period where people are freaking out. It seemed like the world was gone mad. There's this war, destruction, death, mass movements, revolutions. That's what a revolutionary epoch is. And we are in a similar epoch. At that time, capitalism had a scare, actually. You had the Russian Revolution of 1917. And not just in Russia. This was the first time the working class had ever taken power anywhere. And at least they began the socialist construction. Don't have time to get into it. Wasn't able to be completed. But that was a beacon of hope, and it spread all over Europe, and even in Canada. You had the Winnipeg General Strike of 1919 that was inspired by the Russian Revolution. So capitalism had a scare at that time. And communism became, like Matt said in the introduction, there was a period where communism was a dominant ideology in the working class, in the labor movement. The trade unions, a lot of them in Canada, were built by communists. In the 50s and 60s, they had to run the communists out of the unions because they controlled a lot of unions. In BC, this was the case. In the mining unions, in the woodworking unions, they were dominated by the communists. And this was because of the period. Capitalism was in abject crisis. People could see it, and they were looking for a way out, right? So what happened? The post-war boom. So after World War II, you had a kind of a new situation arise. And the reason why I think it's important that we go through this is because this was the basis at which we'll call it the so-called liberal world order was created, which we have basically lived under since then. And that order is now dying. We have to get that through our heads. So at the time, the post-war boom was it was a new situation. It was kind of anomalous. You had the European powers fight it out. You had mass destruction in Europe of the productive forces, the most principal productive force, the working class. Millions were slaughtered. But also the machinery, all this stuff was destroyed. War is a massive destructive force. So that provided some space for capitalism to rebuild. Also, another factor was America, which had been a rising power and had been challenging Britain as the main imperialist power, arose as basically the imperialist power. Whereas before that, there were multiple. There was Britain, France, there was other powers. America was one of them, but they were all wrecked by the war. And at exiting World War II, America was the dominant power, and they were able to impose themselves on the world. And they imposed a new regime on the world. And the main contradictions of the capitalist system, some of them were sort of temporarily and partially overcome. One of them is the nation state. The bourgeoisie arises in a nation. There's monopolies. They take control. They control the state, and they use the state to defend their interests. And that's why you have wars, like World War I or World War II. But then you had this period where the U.S. basically forced, it was kind of partially a product of the Cold War, they forced the Western imperialist world to collaborate, to lower their trade barriers, to have this free trade regime, to not tariff each other. They actually started lowering the tariffs. You had the GATT, and then you had the WTO, the World Trade Organization. You had these different trade relationships that were established. And on the basis of this, you had massive growth. The post-war boom, it's known as the post-war boom for a reason. It was a massive boom, a massive upswing, not just any old boom. It was a huge upswing for the system. And this is the basis on which not just the liberal world order was established, but in countries like Canada, America, Western Europe, you had the creation of the welfare state. You had good union jobs. You had class peace, actually. A regime of class collaboration, not class war. The 20s and 30s were just class warfare, revolution, instability was reigning supreme. But in the post-war period, you had class peace. You had these classes. This is the rise of collective bargaining agreements. Even in the name, it sounds all innocuous. We all collectively bargain with the boss and maybe come up with something that suits both of us, right? We don't need to fight. And you see this in the way that the trade union leaders talk today. Why aren't they bargaining in good faith? Why aren't they bargaining? What's going on? Please, this isn't what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to be nice, and we'll give you something. See this in Canada Post the other day. The union said, "Well, we'll de-escalate a bit as a sign of good faith to the employer." Where do you think that's going to go? It's not going to produce anything good, because in this situation in particular, weakness invites aggression. And Canada Post and the Labour Minister and the ruling class they're smelling blood in the water, and they're going to go for the jugular. And they're going to work, their ultimate goal is to privatize Canada Post. Canada Post was created in this post-war period, actually. So was the Postal Workers Union. So was this regime of class collaboration, which has come to an end fundamentally. This sort of post-war period, it's important to note, this actually was exclusive to the Western capitalist world, which is a minority of the world population. Sometimes people think, yeah, but communism never succeeded with capitalism. It succeeded so well. But the majority of the world's population, this is absolutely false. Absolutely false for Africa, for Asia, for large parts of the world, for Latin America. Capitalism has been an abject failure. And this period, during the post-war period, the imperialists were extracting wealth off of the colonial, ex-colonial world. And they used that partially to buy class peace at home. This boom, this post-war boom, did come to an end eventually. The 1970s, 80s, and there was this was again a revolutionary era. You had the rise of revolutionary groups, you had overthrowing governments, you had a very tumultuous time. The bourgeoisie shifted from the post-war period where they had adopted this Keynesianist ideology of state deficit financing, of creating programs, to try to buy off the workers, or at least a section of them. They could no longer afford that because there was the crisis of the system. This was the context in which you had Brian Mulroney, you had Bennett here in BC, you had a whole slew of these right-wing politicians like Reagan, Thatcher, that basically took a hatchet to social services. This was the context in which you had Operation Solidarity in British Columbia and similar type of movements all over the world where the working class started fighting back. And this is I want to take a bit of a detour and talk about, the capitalist system as a whole. So they had this post-war boom. That was this massive boom, and then that came to an end. But why? I think some on the left that don't understand the capitalist system, they actually have more faith in it than the bourgeoisie do. Whereas we don't have faith in the system. We study it. We study how it works. And inbuilt into the system is fundamental contradiction. This main contradiction Marx talks about, he talks about in the Communist Manifesto actually, is the crisis of overproduction. So the system can have periods where it's more healthy or less healthy. Today is definitely a period where it's declining. It's like an old man whose breathing is labored, whose heartbeat is erratic, is having a lot more trouble. But during all of the life of capitalism, it has this crisis of overproduction, and it shows itself in the boom-bust cycle, where you have big expansion, but in the expansion period, the capitalists invest in the means of production. They increase the productivity of labor. They can produce more goods with less workers. And what this means is that in every single industry, the workers, this is innate to capitalism. It cannot be taken out of the system. This is how the system works at its fundamental core. The workers, therefore, cannot buy back the products that they produce because they are not paid the full value of their labor. And this happens in every single industry. So what you have is capitalism is the only system that has ever existed that enters into crisis because it has too much shit. It produces too much. Now, it doesn't produce too much for humanity. It produces too much for the market to consume, meaning there are goods that cannot be bought. They could be consumed, but the people that need to consume them don't have money because of this innate contradiction in the system. I'll give you a very good example that everyone probably knows here in Vancouver. The housing market. There are currently, I looked it up, 2,500 empty condos in Vancouver, in a city that is one of the worst in the world for the housing crisis, for rental prices. There are empty condos. This is expected to rise to 3,500 by the end of the year. Hold on, Vancouver. You don't get number one on this one. I'm from Toronto. There are currently 23,000 empty condos in the GTA. This is astounding. I actually read a story in the mainstream press that said, well, Carney's making big news about trying to solve the housing crisis. Why doesn't he just take those condos and put people in them? Well, he's not a socialist. That's what we would do. We'd say, condos, people that need condos or places to live, let's do it. But they can't afford it. They can't afford it. That's the whole problem. So it's a prime example of the crisis of overproduction. Now you have developers that are backing out of projects that are actually, there's a 13% slump in production of homes and condos and apartments in Toronto. It's astounding, in the middle of a housing crisis. There's many examples we can find of the crisis of overproduction. So, and this is a fundamental fact of capitalism. And this crisis expresses itself more strongly when there's a general downward slope. Because there's layoffs, people have less money, they can buy less. Connected to this, you could look at this crisis and you could say, well, why doesn't capitalism therefore always have a crisis? If the workers are not paid the full value of their labor, then how do they ever sell the goods? Why? How could they? Well, there are many ways that the ruling class uses to delay the inevitable, to get around something temporarily. One of them is debt. So during the post-war boom, actually, consumer debt was very small. Actually, people didn't have credit cards. Mortgages were, if they existed, they were tiny. It was not a big thing. But with the crisis in the 70s, what they did is like, oh, geez, we have a crisis. Nobody can afford anything. Why don't you take out a line of credit, buy something, take out a car loan, take out a mortgage, get a credit card. And this started to be the norm. Today, in Canada, consumer debt is at a record high of all time. It's $2.5 trillion, which is more than the Canadian GDP. Which tells you something about the strength or lack thereof of the Canadian economy, which is not in a healthy situation. So, does that solve the problem? Well, no, it doesn't. I think anyone here who has lost their job and they decided to get a credit card to start spending that knows that you didn't solve the problem. You're just delaying the inevitable, and actually you're making it far worse when you have to deal with the crisis that you're facing in your life. You're going to have to get a job, right? So similar things with the system. They can inject debt. They can inject debt to a certain point, and what happens is they kick the can down the road, and then when the crisis comes, it's far worse, and there's all these contradictions in the system, and there's big collapses. Similar thing with government debt. Government debt in Canada, combined provincial and federal debt, is $2.3 trillion, which is also more than the Canadian GDP, more than the Canadian economy. which tells you a lot. So the government has also gone massively into debt to fund things, to try to buoy up the market, right? Not just buoy up the market, they inject it into companies to try to help them stay afloat. That's basically what they're doing. It shows the lack of health, actually. The capitalist system in Canada is very unhealthy. So yeah, this is precisely what happened in 2008. I joined the party in 2005, and that was actually, the bourgeoisie were jubilant. They had Stephen Harper, they had George Bush, they were like, this is great. Socialism was a dirty word everywhere. The Soviet Union's dead. They were like, everything's amazing. It's capitalism from here on in. It's the end of history. That's what they had been preaching. And then you had 2008, subprime mortgage collapse. All of these cheap mortgages they had given to poor people so they could still continue to buy homes, the market fell apart. And this really ushered in a new situation. And ever since then, you've had a massive slump in production. You've had a massive increase. They've just increased the indebtedness. And also, you've had an increased tendency to protectionism. So this gets into the collapse of the world order. Because as the crisis has gotten worse and worse and worse, there's been a tendency in each capitalist state to try to protect its own industry, to protect its own bourgeoisie, its own ruling class, from competition. So instead of the free trade regime of the so-called liberal world order, you have every country kind of just looking out for themselves. This didn't start with Donald Trump. It did not start with Donald Trump. Any politician, they're all trying to blame Donald Trump for this. This started way before Donald Trump. Of course, Donald Trump does accelerate this, and he does represent this tendency in a distilled way more than any other politician. But yeah, this process is something that's built into the system when it enters into decline. You had the last epoch of protectionism was the 1930s. Why? Because you had the Great Depression, and all the different countries started putting tariffs on each other. That's actually what turned the Great Depression, or it turned the 1929 crash into the Great Depression, because all the different economies were trying to protect themselves. And that collapsed world trade. It had big blows to productivity and efficiency, and it drove the world down, productivity down. Massive layoffs. This was also the growth of the Communist Party. It goes part and parcel with the radicalization of the workers, and they're looking for a way out of capitalist barbarism. So yes, from the connection of world trade to growth is very clear. From 1990 to 2008, there was 192% growth in world trade. And at this period, world growth was actually in the 90s, because of the collapse of the Soviet Union and because China was brought into the world market, the capitalist system had a kind of after the 80s, that period I had talked about, it had a kind of a new lease on life. They were able to, capitalism always wants to expand. It was able to expand into the ex-Soviet states and then bring China into the market. And one of the factors that allowed them to avoid class struggle in the West was precisely using China. The Chinese working class was highly educated, highly efficient, and highly cheap. So all the imperialists, and as the Chinese Communist Party turned their economy back to capitalism, they opened up the market. All the big companies invested. iPhones are produced there. Almost everything was started to be produced in China. And this allowed them to avoid class struggle in the West because if your wages may not have been going up. Most people here probably don't remember the 90s, but I remember the 90s. Your wages may not be going up, but there's lots of cheap stuff. The price of commodities would come down because they're being produced with cheap labor overseas. Now that again, imperialism is another method that the capitalists used to temporarily overcome the crisis or try to delay it. And they did delay it. But now we see the results of this. That it was only a delay, and now with very serious consequences. That from 2008, first, China now has risen as a global power. It is a global trading empire, and it's not simply a low-wage economy like it was in the 1990s, producing cheap toys and electronics for the West. They're rivaling America in key sectors of technology, in industry, in electric vehicles, electric batteries, in AI, in a whole bunch of cutting-edge technology. They are rivaling America. And actually, just look at this past week. What's China did? They're trying to put their foot on the jugular of America and the West. They're cutting off critical minerals, which are key to all sorts of military technology and other technology. And what's Donald Trump doing? He's responding with a further 100% tariff on the Chinese economy. What's the result? I don't know if you guys watched the markets. They basically crashed yesterday. We'll see what happens next week, but this could plunge the global economy downward into a downward spiral. And with that, mass layoffs, capitalists pulling their investments out, and the whole entire crisis comes full force. So yeah, because of this rise of China, and because of this increasing crisis of the capitalist system, from 2008 to 2024, world trade only grew by 24%. Whereas, like I said, the previous period had been almost 200% growth. So basically what's been happening, there's been a tendency towards home shoring, towards protecting your home market, preferential treatment for your home industries, tariffs, subsidies, these types of things. Because capitalism is in crisis and it cannot operate as it previously has. And this is ultimately why we have the breakdown of this world order that was established after World War II, with the post-war boom and this. Also, the fact that America is no longer able to force itself on the world. You see, they actually still are trying to a little bit. Donald Trump is a funny phenomenon because he came to power partially because he represents most clearly, and this is one thing, I think a lot of people and the liberal establishment talks about Donald Trump as if he's just this chaotic individual that's doing dumb things, which, there's a certain there is a certain truth to that. But as Marxists, we need to look beyond the appearance and see the deep process underneath. And if you look at it, you have to admit that what Donald Trump represents is that wing of the American ruling class that has realized that they cannot continue like they did in the past. They are no longer the world police. They can no longer do that. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, they spent trillions on those wars. I saw numbers, upwards of $6 trillion on those wars. That's 3 times the Canadian economy they spent on those wars. And what did they get out of it? Nothing. They bankrupted the American government because the neocons were overconfident. So Donald Trump represents, not because he cares, not like he gives a crap about Iraqis or Afghanis or anything like that, or Palestinians for that matter, or Ukrainians for that matter. It has nothing to do with that. It's pure economics. What they want to do is they want to retrench themselves in their natural sphere of influence in the Americas, pull out of the Middle East, abandon Europe, they don't need them anymore, and retrench themselves in what they call Fortress America, so that they can focus on the main enemy, that is China. As their main economic competition in the world. Their main economic competition is China. It isn't Russia, actually. It isn't all this stuff that's happening in the Middle East. It's not of fundamental national security interest to America, actually. So that's why they're trying to do this ceasefire. We'll see. Can't really go into it. We'll see how long that sticks, because obviously Netanyahu and the Zionists have their own interests here, but Trump wants that to pull back so there can be some stability, and he doesn't need to be funding this and intervening. So yes, some people have said that the rise of Trump, actually it's so ubiquitous on the left. It's a fascist takeover. This is fascism, and you can find all these authoritarian quotes and things that Trump has said or done to try to justify that. Now, as Marxists, we believe this doesn't really help us. Words have meaning, and we don't throw them around as insults, but we have to be able to scientifically understand the process in front of us. So yeah, simply calling Donald Trump is this a rise of fascism? Well, fascism in the 1920s and 30s was a mass movement of armed militia that were mobilized to crush the working class, the organized working class, to liquidate the unions, right? This is what it represented. And really, when you look at the Trump phenomenon, it's quite different than this. You have to look at the entire process. So also, if Donald Trump's a fascist, a lot of the reasons why people point that, they say, oh, but look what he did he brought the National Guard in, he's attacking, sometimes the reason is bad, he's attacking the FBI. I'm like, well, fucking FBI sucks, you know. He cut U.S. aid. I was like, yeah, U.S. aid was a U.S. imperialist department that they used to gain influence in certain countries. I was like, I don't really care about U.S. aid. There's lots of things that have been said. He's attacking the courts. I was like, the U.S. courts are horrible, you know? So this is a fight between two wings of the ruling class, ultimately. And we got to be careful that we're not siding with the liberals and giving the impression that the liberals are better. They are not better. Actually, the main reactionary force in the world during the entire post-war period that conducted wars and genocides and massacres and mass starvation of people was the liberals. There was the liberals in the West. Now, I'm not saying Donald Trump is better, but who's the fascist, right? we got to be careful. This is not actually a description that helps us understand this. Also, the Democrats have brought the National Guard in the streets of America too. And if you look across the Western world, as capitalism declines, the capitalist states are all implementing the similar policies. They're all cutting social services. They're all scapegoating immigrants. They're all increasing the military spending. They're all increasing surveillance. They're all increasing funding to the police. They're all attacking pro-Palestine activists. Look what's happening in Britain. Keir Starmer, it's a Labour government. They have banned Palestine Action, and they're arresting anyone that holds up a sign that says that they support this organization. Is Keir Starmer a fascist? Anyway, moving on. So how do we understand the Trump phenomenon? And not just the Trump phenomenon. I want to look at this broadly. The phenomenon of right populism. Because you have that a little bit everywhere. As the system has been decaying and people's lives are getting smashed, living conditions have been falling, people are looking for a way out. And what has the left done? The mainstream left, the NDP. In Quebec, you have Québec Solidaire. You have, internationally, you got Bernie Sanders, AOC, Mamdani, I would include in that. All these type of left-wing figures around the world, they have attached themselves to the liberal establishment. They're clinging for dear life to the liberals and defending the liberals and arguing to vote for them, to block the fascists, actually. So this argument has actually been the main thing that has aided them, that has aided the right-wing populists, that has aided the Trump types. Why? Because working class people, they're looking for an explanation, they're looking for a way out. And you're basically saying, we're not going to give you a left-wing one. We're just saying those guys are really, really bad. But listen to what they're saying. Listen to what Donald Trump says. He talks about the working class. He talks about making America great, bringing jobs back. He talks about, if you're a working class person, that sounds better than what the liberals are offering, right? It does. And you can understand why a big layer of the working class voted for Trump. You could say whatever you want. They're more rural workers or whatnot. They're still working class people. And we have to be able to provide an explanation and an alternative to them. So yes, the real explanation for Trump is that the left has not provided a way out, has not provided an explanation. They have not said, this is a problem of capitalism. The billionaires, the capitalists are the ones ruining the situation. We need to build a mass working class force and fight for a new system with production not for profit, for need, where we can use the massive wealth in our society, the trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars of wealth, to solve all these problems in the world. They have not said that. They've said, yeah, maybe a little bit better, maybe. I don't know, maybe something. Vote for the liberals, This has been the type of thing that you get. And so it's not surprising, therefore, that you have the rise of the Trump phenomenon and the right populists all over. Even in British Columbia, you got this Rustad guy. You got Pierre Poilievre in Canada, who's been using this kind of working class discourse. In the last election, he won working class ridings all over the country. He won working class ridings in Winnipeg, all in Ontario, blue-collar union ridings, all voted for the Conservatives. They abandoned the NDP in droves because the NDP were complicit in the last government that oversaw the decline in their living standards. This is the punishment for the policy of class collaboration and liberal reformist ideas. That's the reason for the rise of the Trump phenomenon. So, yes. Moving on. Trump most clearly represents this tendency. He wants to destroy the old world order. He has no scruples. He does not see any benefit in it. He doesn't, and so there is a bit of a logic in his madness. He represents that wing of the ruling class that wants to retrench and focus on China. He doesn't really care much for NATO, actually. It doesn't really work for America. He doesn't really care much for Ukraine. If you look at his last speech at the United Nations General Assembly, he changed what he was saying. Instead of saying Ukraine was losing the war, he said, oh, Ukraine is winning. Ukraine's so strong. You know what? They're so strong, I think they can win without us. And Europe, you're so good, Europe. You help them. We're out. That's basically what, and I think the Europeans at first were like, oh, great. And then they're like, oh, shit. This is basically what Trump's been trying to do. But he wants to destroy that world order. And the Europeans, you can see the looks on their face. They're like, oh my God, we're screwed. And they relied on American protection. They did, or they relied. Canada as well. Canada relied on American military protection. The protection of Canadian imperialist interests all over the world. Banking, mining, stuff like that. And Donald Trump is not offering that protection. Or if he is, he's like, you got to do what I say. Actually, if you saw it in the news, Howard Lutnick said the other day, well, in the trade relations between Canada and America, if you're looking at the situation now and you want to maintain that, you're not going to be happy. That's not what's going to happen. This is a death knell for industry in Ontario in particular. He said, vehicles will not be produced in Canada. They will be produced in America. And you're going to have to live with that. This is what America first means. He literally said, America first, Canada second. You're going to have to play game with what they want. And you notice Carney is capitulating all along the line, because they cannot resist this big power. So yes, I mentioned this rise in protectionism. Every power is looking to protect their own markets. And what is protectionism? Protectionism fundamentally means prioritizing a less efficiently produced product locally. That's what it means. Because why wouldn't you just buy the more efficiently produced, cheaper one that was produced in another country? We don't want to do that because it threatens our home industry. So we're going to put a tariff on you and then force everyone to buy the less efficiently produced product. So what that means is this process of the post-war boom and the new world order or liberal world order, it increased the productivity, it created these supply chains, and it increased the productivity of labor in general. And that was the big boom, and that was the basis on which you had increased living conditions, you had the welfare state in the West and all that. What's happening? It's the unwinding of that. It's going to be a lowering of the productivity of labor, a prioritizing less efficiently produced products. A good example of this, electric vehicles. BYD is the biggest electric vehicle producer in the world. That's a Chinese company. Can you buy them in Canada? Okay, the BYD Seagull, it's their cheapest car. In China sells for $11,000. Do you know the cheapest electric vehicle in Canada? Sells for $40,000. We can't buy that though. They won't let us put tariffs, and they don't let China sell those. Because why? Because they're trying to protect a very inefficient, embryonic, almost non-existent industry in Canada. Actually, it's mostly done because America asked Canada to do that. But yeah, that's just one example of the protectionism. So, but the big takeaway here is this is leading to a collapse in productivity and efficiency, actually, and the breakup of the trading relations that have existed for decades. Yes. So yes, America used to be the power. They could do whatever they wanted. George Bush Sr. called it the New World Order. A lot of people were freaked out by that. There was a lot of Marxists in the 90s that talked about this empire. There's an empire being established because America was the big dog that could just say jump, and you said how high, and they would order everyone around, and that's what happened. That's not happening now. Look what's happening with Brazil. They tried to tell Brazil what to do, and Brazil said, piss off. Why? Brazil shifted all their trade to China. So now China's buying soybeans from Brazil, meat, other things, instead of them selling it to the US. Because they don't need to listen to America, because they can just trade with China. Whereas before, if America threatened economic sanctions on a country, you'd just completely destroy your economy. That's not the case now. So you have all these middle powers that are balancing between America and China. You see this with India. India is supposed to be an American ally. And Modi went to China, he was in that military parade, and he's doing deals with them, right? You have this all over the world. This is the way we can understand the chaos that is happening in the world. There's an inter-imperialist conflict between China and America. That's what's happening. And it's the decline of the unipolar world. That's what it was known as. And the Trump people say this directly. Marco Rubio said, it's not normal for the world to simply have a unipolar power. This was an anomaly. It was a product of the end of the Cold War. But eventually, you were going to reach back to a point where you had a multipolar world, multi-great powers in different parts of the planet. This is what the Trump people recognize. And they want to pull back and sort of realize that situation and not do what Biden was doing, which was start wars with Russia and do all that sort of thing. So this is what explains the turbulence in world relations. Yes, moving on. So yes, related to this, the system's collapsing, and they can no longer afford all of the things that came out of the post-war period. They can't afford the welfare state. They can't afford good union jobs, good wages, good benefits. And every single advanced capitalist country in the West is the same tendency. This is why when some people say, oh, I'm not a communist, I'm a socialist. I'm a democratic socialist, like Norway or Sweden. I think those people don't know anything about those countries because the same exact process is occurring in Scandinavia. Yes, they did, in those countries, reach a high level of unionization and a high level of a big welfare state and things like this. That's all being cut. That's all being slashed, just like everywhere. And the results. So as the system decays, there's pressure all around, and there's class struggle and revolutionary movements erupting all over the world. That is an inevitability. That's an inevitable product of this situation. We have to understand that that is going to happen more and more, and it will happen here as well. In August, Matt mentioned this briefly, a mass movement erupted in Indonesia after a delivery driver was killed. You notice the trigger for each one of these revolutions is always different. So it's not the trigger that caused it, it was the general. The general conditions caused the revolution, and the killing of the delivery driver in Indonesia was the straw that broke the camel's back, to use a dialectical phrase. This quickly turned into a revolutionary uprising of the masses. Police stations burned, government buildings torched, rich ministers' houses raided by poor people. This is like literally class, like very visceral class struggle, what you were seeing over there. This, not long after this erupted in Nepal. Scenes of the parliament on fire. We've all seen it. We have it on the front cover of our latest paper, the so-called Gen Z revolution. The government was overthrown in Nepal. You had scenes of the ministers getting ninja kicked in the streets as they're trying to run away. It's literally the masses, they don't know what to do. They don't have any leadership. They're rage, right? After decades and decades of miserable conditions. We've already had revolutions in Kenya, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and more, and you have all these revolutions spread to a whole bunch of different countries. And very, very importantly, as we're starting to see, this is not limited. Normally you're in Canada, oh yeah, that's something that happens way over there in a far-off land like Indonesia, right? No, it's starting to happen in the West. So France, mass demos. They brought down 4 governments in the last 2 years. Oh no, they brought one down and then he recently was reappointed again. They're very confused in France. But yeah, the working class took this initiative. They said, we don't trust these guys. Why is the government continuing being brought down? Why is the prime minister having to resign all the time? Because they're trying to pass a reactionary budget that has cuts in it. And nobody wants to be tarnished with that. Not the left wing, and even the far right people, Marine Le Pen, they don't want to be seen to be supporting it. So the government falls, the government falls, the government falls. And what's happened is the working class started to realize, we have to stop this with our means. This block everything movement started. Millions of people in the streets. Over 1 million people were blocking things in France. And yes, revolutions don't respect borders. They don't. We are internationalists, and the working class is international. So, you had this movement around the flotilla. You had the flotilla, one of the flotillas that was getting intercepted by Israel, getting attacked. There were trade unionists on it from Spain, from Italy. And the trade unions started demanding their government to do something. And the government they sent the ships, but then the ships didn't do anything. So the masses drew the conclusion, we need to take matters into our own hands. And they started this movement. They did general strike in Italy a week ago, Friday. We have to understand how significant that is. This is not, the workers did not go on strike for wage increases or their own pensions. They did not go on strike for their own material interests. Sometimes you hear this on the left. Oh no, we got to tone down our demands because workers, they're not very smart. They only understand things that directly, materially interest them. False. Workers in Italy went on strike for Gaza. That's a high level of consciousness. They went on general strike, shutting down everything in Italy, millions of workers on strike because of the genocide in Gaza. And people realizing that appeals to these imperialist politicians don't work and they need to take matters into their own hands. You had a student strike in Spain. Now you've had a bit, not a full general strike, but somewhat of a limited worker strike movement in Spain as well. Mass demonstrations across Europe and Norway and other countries. Yes, what is occurring here, Trotsky described as the molecular process of socialist revolution. Why do people draw socialist conclusions? Because we told them? I mean, some people. But no, quite often, when you meet anybody, if you talk to people here, you always ask, how did you get interested? There's always a different reason. But when I started doing this, we would never get this many people in a room. There would never be this many people contacting us to get involved. Why? Is this molecular process occurring in everyone's minds? Everyone can see what's happening. They're questioning, they're wondering, and they're starting to get organized. And this is what's happening all over the world. It's a general revolutionary consciousness developing. And Canada is not isolated from that. In this world order that had been established previously, Canada was the US's little buddy, was a privileged country, benefited from the biggest consumer market in the world, benefited from the protection of American imperialism. Now, I said communism used to be a significant presence in Canada in the 20s and 30s. So in the post-war period, that started to be not the case anymore. And it hasn't been the case for a long time. Our aim is to make communism great again, to bring communism back. And we are succeeding. We are succeeding. So I think that, this is our goal, and I think we should be confident in that goal because of this. The situation is ripe. The situation is absolutely ripe for us to do that. All of these things that made life semi-bearable in Canada, the healthcare, the social services, the good union jobs. Look what's happening. There's a strike, BCGEU. There's an Alberta teacher strike. There's an Ontario college strike. There's the transit workers in Montreal. They're on strike. There's the Canada Post strike, CUPW. And every single union, it's exactly the same thing. They're not negotiating in good faith. They're trying to crush them. They want their living conditions are dropping, and they're looking for a way out. The workers, because this basis of what made life semi-bearable in Canada is going away, and everyone kind of feels that in their veins. And Trump has accelerated this process of decay in Canada. Of course, Mark Carney. Everyone refers to him as the CEO of Canada. Sometimes they say that I hear it on the news, like they say it in a positive way. I'm like, it's not positive, that's bad. Yes. And he's happy to do the bidding of the bourgeoisie. He actually has an open door policy with corporate Canada. They've just been coming in, making all sorts of demands of him. Actually, his staff and all these various new committees that he created, he's gone out of his way to get Goldman Sachs finance advisors and capitalists, pay them a whole bunch of money to put them, and that's basically what's running the government. The ministers seem not like they don't know what's going on. It's just Mark Carney and his capitalist buddies that have been doing this, which is 15% cuts across the board over the next few years in all major departments, massive increase in military spending, and attacking the labor movement. Air Canada, Canada Post, that's just the first shots of this. It's attacking the labor movement, attacking union, all this bullshit about we will never be the 51st state because we're Canada. We believe in good jobs and blah, blah, blah. Bullshit. He's attacking good jobs. He's attacking unions. These liberals, they like to talk as if they're different, they're more progressive or something like that. That's absolute nonsense. So in this situation, the old ideas in the labor movement are clearly insufficient. You see, over the past year and a bit, what we've seen is labor leaders. You've actually seen a process in which the ranks of the labor movement are so universally angry and mobilized. Air Canada strike. Did you guys go to the picket lines here? They were massive. People were so ready to fight. And then what happened? The leaders announced they defied the law. And then they announced, oh, by the way, go back to work. We got a deal. It's really good. And then everyone learned, oh, it's not very good. It was a bad deal. And they took away their right to vote on it. They had no real right to vote on that contract. They took it away from them because they were scared. The labor leaders, they knew that if they gave them the right to vote, they would actually be back on strike. They told them, we're not going back on strike. No. You can, even if you vote no, it's just going to be arbitrated. This is union after union after union after union. You're seeing that the labor leaders, that their heads are stuck in this past period that no longer exists. We're headed into a revolutionary period, not unlike the 20s and 30s. So yeah, this old class collaboration regime is breaking down. And we need revolutionary ideas. So there's a contradiction between what the workers need and want and then what their leaders are proposing and what the strategy the leaders have. You saw this with the Alberta teachers. They used to be, 20 years ago, they were the highest paid teachers in the country. What happened? No strikes, 0 strikes. Continually accepting bad contracts, the leaders. And the workers would vote for it, shrugging their shoulders. Oh, I guess that's the best. They said that was the best. I don't know. We'll just vote for it. What happened this time? They're like, no, we cannot take this anymore. They voted 95% to strike. The leaders came to them the workers had voted on a 34% wage increase. They said, that's what we need to keep our wages, to bring them up to the level of other teachers and to actually survive. And the leaders came forward, 12% over 3 years. And they were like, no. They voted it down, 90%. And then the leaders came back with it a week later. Vote on the exact same deal again. They voted it down. And they went on strike. And then the leaders organized the strike. And they said, but important thing, no pickets. We're not going to picket to schools. So you're not shutting the schools down. So it's not a strike. So what you see is the leaders in Alberta, the leaders of the teachers' union were dragged, kicking and screaming by their own members to a strike that they don't actually want to lead. So this is the contradiction we have in Canada between the leadership and the ranks. And we need to revive the fighting traditions of the labor movement. We need to provide a revolutionary communist perspective and a fight. That's what workers want. So this is the justification for what we're doing with the Revolutionary Communist Party. We seek to rebuild the genuine revolutionary traditions of the working class in Canada, going back to the 30s to the 20s, going back to Operation Solidarity, going back to the 1972 general strike in Quebec, going back to the 1919 Winnipeg general strike. Our class has revolutionary traditions in Canada. We will uncover those traditions and teach them to working class people in struggle today. So we seek to rise to this challenge. We are not depressed by the world situation. We understand it for what it is. It is an epoch of wars, counter-revolutions, and revolutions. That is what this epoch is. And we will rise to the challenge to provide a revolutionary communist solution to the crisis of capitalism. And that's what we're here to do at this school.